Welcome back to the PFF NFL show. I am Trevor Sikkema. That is Dalton Wasserman. And boy, do we have a fun one for you here today. We're talking off-season grades for every single team in the NFL. So we've talked about free agency grades. We've talked about draft grades. We've even talked about some of the good and bad coaching and general manager moves that teams have made throughout the offseason. And now we get to wrap it into one. We're going to take a look at every team, look at their rosters, look at their coaching staffs, look at the general manager positions in the front offices, see what has changed, and say whether or not we like it compared to what could have been the expectation for them, which goes into a lot of things. Draft position, cap space they had, whether they had vacancies or not. So, Dalton, we got a lot of things to think about here. These grades are from yours truly. So we might get to have a little bit of debate on here. We might get to, fist fight with words, as they often do on these shows for a little disagreement. But how you doing, my friend? Big project today, so I'm excited for it.
Good. I've told you, these are my favorite episodes when you just make the whole list and I get to pick apart where you're wrong. Or maybe if you're right on everything, then we have a nice, quick, short episode and we get on out of here. But no, this feels like, I like this time of year and these types of episodes now is it really starts to feel like we get to now start to preview the season coming up as opposed to constantly looking back and seeing where teams got to fill holes, and maybe we get another trade or two here pretty soon. But I think we really start to look at the future and look at what 2025 is going to look like for all 32.
Yeah, hold on. What's up with this? I'm like, there's like 3 shows in a row that I did the articles for it, and then you just get to kick back and just react to what I'm doing.
I don't know. Listen. I say it all the time. You're the star of the show. If you're the star of the show and you're doing all the work, man, my life gets real easy here.
I need to be worse at my job. That's what I'm. I need to be worse at my job, and they need to ask you to do these things.
See, you're stealing. See, I'm usually the one that goes the bare minimum route. That's how it always is. You just the bare minimum that gets you by. Don't steal my role here. You can only have so many people doing the bare minimum in one building.
Okay. All right. Just that's not true. You go above and beyond, my friend. We got a lot to get to here on today's episode, so let's go. Let's start right away. We're going in alphabetical order of the city names, not the team names. You guys will catch on with that pretty quickly because it starts here with the Arizona Cardinals. So I gave the Arizona Cardinals a B+ here for their offseason. Ton of new defensive talent that is on that team. When you look at free agency and the draft, they added guys like Dalvin Tomlinson, Calais Campbell, Josh Sweat, Akeem Davis-Gaither at linebacker level. Then they drafted Will Johnson. They got Walter Nolan. They've got Denzel Burke, Keaton Crawford, Cody Simon, Jordan Birch as well, their third rounder there. I like a lot of what this team did. They didn't have any coaching or general manager changes, so we're not really thinking about that. The only reason why I wouldn't give this hey, man, really great job, well done, the defense got a lot better, new influx of talent is they didn't really do anything to the offensive line. And I felt like the offensive line was an area that they could have addressed in the draft or free agency, just somewhere along the line. The interior offensive line, we talked about it last week in the team needs show. That interior offensive line still in the short term is a big worry for me. And then long term at offensive tackle with Jonah Williams going into that last year of his deal, they don't really have anybody waiting in the wings. And they don't really have anybody for new competition along the interior offensive line. So I give them a B+ because I do think that the team got better and they brought in some really good players. But ultimately, I do wish that they would have prioritized offensive trenches a little bit more. So I went B+ for the Cardinals here.
Yeah, no, I think this is the offseason, especially the draft of Jonathan Gannon, right? 2 years ago, they were the lowest graded defense, I should say, in football. This year, moved up to 23rd, got a little better at preventing explosive plays. You saw a couple players start to emerge, but this is now the part where Gannon tries to make this defense in his image, right? And they feel like, okay, if we support this offense enough, if we put Kyler Murray in enough good spots with the run game and with the defense, we can then just allow him to use his heroics when he needs to, as opposed to all the time throughout the game. Especially we saw that down in the stretch the second half of last season when it felt like there was too much on Kyler Murray's plate. Now Jonathan Gannon's trying to build that elite defense, and this offseason, if it works, is going to be the reason that he got to do it.
Yeah, and I think that appropriately this upcoming season is hey, Jonathan Gannon's got his side of the ball all figured out. Now it really is about Kyler Murray and seeing how he can evolve, because if Kyler has sort of that closest to MVP type of a season that we thought he might have last year. If he has that this year, then they're good to go, right? Then you feel like the winning window is going to be incredible for this team because next offseason they're going to absolutely slam the gas pedal to the floor on the offensive side of the ball, and they're going to be a really complete roster. But if Murray is more of the same, a roller coaster, and just not good enough for them to be consistent enough to get into the playoffs and have a deep playoff run, then next offseason you start thinking about, okay, are we thinking about other quarterback options here? Are we drafting one? What are we doing with Murray? So I think they've set themselves up the right way. So I wanted to give them a B+ there. The Atlanta Falcons are the next team. I gave the Falcons a C here. And no changes to the coaching staff here for the Atlanta. Well, actually, that's not true. They brought in Jeff Ulbrich to be their defense coordinator, so they have a new defense coordinator. But Raheem Morris, he is the defensive mastermind as the head coach, so he is still there. And then Zach Robinson is still the offensive coordinator. But the reason why I gave the Falcons a C here is they didn't really do much in free agency to help this team. They lose Josh Simmons. They lose Drew Dahlman. So I think they lost a lot of those guys that were great on the team last year. They didn't really replace them with big splashes in free agency. They brought back a couple of guys that were their own. They're really betting on Mike Hughes to have a good season at outside corner opposite A.J. Terrell. And certainly with the draft and getting Xavier Watson there, they're hoping that he could step in at safety from Josh Simmons. But at the time, it felt like they didn't really do a lot in free agency, and instead they lost more talent than they gained. And then sure, the draft was a big splash for them, but it was a big cost to do it, right? It's a future first-round pick to move up and get a guy like James Pierce. So I don't want to be overly harsh because of what this team lost. I look at this draft and I say, yeah, okay, it was a good draft, but again, the cost that it took for them to have the splash draft that they needed to sort of make up for lack of moves during free agency and bringing in veterans that could have maybe really helped out this team in the pass rush category, I gave them a C. Do you think that's too harsh with how I looked at the additions and the subtractions that the Falcons had this year?
No, I think it's absolutely fair. And what you think about is this offseason, the entire offseason and everything that came with it, all the consequences that come with it, is really just the fact that they were hamstrung with one more year of the Kirk Cousins contract, right? Even if they trade him, they're still stuck with a massive cap hit. And even if he stays, he's going to be their backup quarterback. They just never had the flexibility to spend money. So when you look at them losing guys like Justin Simmons, like Drew Dahlman, that's the big one at center for me. Are they going to be able to replace him on an offensive line that's been elite for the last few years? That's going to be a problem come the season, and it's really because they just didn't have the money. So I think that the offseason we're going to talk about the Falcons making a lot of moves is going to be next year. I think they're not going to be in championship contention this year. They could contend for an NFC South title, I think, if everything goes right with Michael Penix, sure, but that's going to be the big thing, I think, this year is getting these young pass rushers into the NFL and getting them productive in the NFL. And then Michael Penix taking a leap as their full-time starter now, as opposed to starting just the last 3 games of last year. I think this year is about Michael Penix, and then jumping into championship contention is next year and next offseason when Kirk Cousins' contract is off the books.
I think that's a fair point, bringing up the Cousins contract. So I will give you credit there on that one. I still think that I just look at this team and maybe C is a little harsh. It could have gone C+ maybe in this category, but I don't know. I don't feel like the Falcons really got better compared to what they had last season versus maybe what they could have done this year. Baltimore Ravens, I gave them an A-. I think bringing back Ronnie Stanley was the most important thing for this team in free agency, and they did that. So even though it was a quiet free agency period after that, that's really what they needed to do, was make sure that they brought Ronnie Stanley back. So I'm going to give them a job well done there because they were able to do that. They don't lose the player on the offensive line that's very pivotal for them in a winning window, right? This team is a team that has Super Bowl aspirations, and they're good enough to be a Super Bowl team. I thought the draft was very good for them as well, getting Mike Green, getting Malachi Starks. I even like the addition of Emory Jones for them as a guard. Some changes to the offensive line, some guys in and out. I think that it's relatively fine. Like when you look at the players who they have along the interior offensive line and sort of how they drafted as well, because not only did they bring in Emory Jones, but also Garrett Dellinger. They brought in Joe Noteboom too. They've drafted Carson Vincent. So I think that they did enough to at least get some new talent and some young talent there along the offensive line. Didn't really do anything at receiver. I know they brought in DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not exactly sure how much DeAndre Hopkins really has left in the tank, but Wide receiver remained untouched for them. That's sort of what keeps it from being a straight up A for me. But I do think that the Baltimore Ravens had a good offseason when it comes to making sure their winning window remains open and they can continue to compete for a Super Bowl while Lamar Jackson's playing the way that he is, and certainly while Derrick Henry is doing the same. So A- here for the Baltimore Ravens for me.
Yeah, I think a big chunk of that for me is they did have a really good draft where they got a lot of value, right? Malachi Starks fits right in there with Kyle Hamilton and Ardarius Washington. Mike Green, if they get through the character concerns and they feel good about that, really adds a jolt to their pass rush. They added some offensive line talent as well. So I think the heaviest moves, like you mentioned, were keeping Ronnie Stanley in a situation where they didn't have a ton of cap room to work with, and he certainly could have left and gone to another contender, maybe like the Kansas City Chiefs, and having a really solid draft. It's another good offseason for the Ravens, I think, considering some of the limited resources they had to use, especially with the salary cap.
The Buffalo Bills, I gave the Bills a similar A- here. Now, a lot of what they did in free agency had to do with their own guys, right? It was big contracts, guys to like Greg Rousseau, Khalil Shakir, Christian Benford, Terrell Bernard were the big contracts that they had there. They brought in Josh Palmer to be a nice little wide receiver addition for them in free agency as well. So a lot of it was retaining their own, but they, again, are in a Super Bowl window. And so that part does make sense for Buffalo. And so I want to make sure that I gave them a thumbs up for doing what they needed to do there. I think had a good draft, right? We've talked about like, okay, yeah, I'm not the biggest Deion Walker fan. Totally fine that they drafted him in the 4th round, though. Taking a chance on him there. They drafted Maxwell Harrison. We've talked about it on the draft grades episode. I would have rather had different corners. Benjamin Morrison was on the board. Trey Amos was on the board. I would have rather had those guys. But overall, I think the draft was very good. The only reason why this isn't a straight up A for me is sort of what we talked about in the team needs episode, and that is this safety group was one of the worst in the NFL in terms of coverage grade. It's the same safety group they had last year. So you're going into, again, a season when you are now the very clear favorites to once again win the division. You're going to be in the playoffs. You're going to be in the hunt for a Super Bowl. And the back end was a major issue for you. And when you go up against the best quarterbacks in the league, to me, that's a big issue. So I like what the Buffalo Bills did. The reason why it's an A- instead of an A is because that safety room went untouched from what it was last season, and they struggled mightily. So those dudes just have to play a lot better, but I gave the Bills an A- here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some of the extensions were a good value, especially Shakir and Benford, considering some of the other cornerback contracts we saw. They got a good deal on Christian Benford. And then you mentioned it, the draft. I really like this draft a lot. I know Hairston, maybe there's a guy or two you would have rather had over him, but I do think he's a pretty good scheme fit in their defense. TJ Sanders and Landon Jackson, I think, could make an early impact on a defensive line that rotates through a lot of pieces. So I like the mentality in the draft of going heavy on defense, because that's really where the problem is at all 3 levels, right? You know, the A- you mentioned, because they didn't touch the safety position. Yeah, I absolutely get it, and that could be a problem when you talk about trying to stop throws over the middle of the field, but they got better at a lot of other spots, especially on their defensive line. So I do like where the Bills are at compared to where they were when we ended last season.
The Carolina Panthers, I gave them a straight up A, and you knew that this one was coming because I gave them an A+ on their draft grade, and I only give out A+. I only give out that plus if I can look at the whole offseason and realize that you navigated things in a great way, and it was the sign of a job well done and a plan that was well constructed. For Carolina, to me, that's absolutely the case. I think that it stings a little bit that they thought they had Milton Williams in hand, and then he ends up going to the New England Patriots, but even independent of that, you talk about the new names that they have added to this team. Bobby Brown, Tershawn Wharton, Patrick Jones II, Nick Scorton, Princely Uman Mielen, Trayvon Merrick, Lathan Ransom. And then on the offensive side of the ball, they get some depth with Rico Dowdle. They draft Trevor Etienne. They've got Tetro McMillan now to be the wide receiver one of that team. Carolina looked at all of their needs and where they needed to change things, and really, I thought, prioritize things excellently. And so no changes in the coaching staff, no changes in the front office to analyze here. But when you just look at the roster overall, Carolina's outlook and potential is so much greater than what it was last year. They hit all of the needs they needed to hit. And in my opinion, at the priority level they needed to be hit. So A here, the only thing that keeps it back from being an offseason A+ is they didn't make any changes in the front office or coaching staff, but they didn't have to, right? So just a straight up A, basically the best grade that the Carolina Panthers could have got from me. me, given the fact that there weren't changes in the offices and in the coaching staff. So I loved what Carolina did this offseason.
Yeah, after having what was pretty clearly the worst defense in football last year, you knew they had to prioritize it, and they've thrown a ton of resources into it. But I absolutely love, my favorite part about all of it is that they get the 8th overall pick in the first round. They're picking early. Are they going to take Jalen Walker or James Pierce Jr. or some sort of pass rusher to help them out? No, they still understand that they have to center a large part of this around Bryce Young. And you would go and get arguably the best receiver in the draft in Tedero McMillan, and he was the best receiver in college football over the past 2 seasons on 10-plus yard targets. And as we got later into the year and Bryce Young came back off the bench and played well down the second half of the season, he was the best quarterback in football when it came to throwing vertically down the field, top passing grade, most big-time throws, and 12 passes dropped there, you see, from their receivers and tight ends. So you look at, okay, he needed more help. He needed a receiver like this who could win downfield and just catch the football as he's making all these throws downfield and into tight windows. That's the word for me. Bryce Young came back the second half of last year and played fearless, throwing the ball wherever he wanted to. Now he's got a receiver that extends that catch radius. He's 6'5". He can jump out of the gym. He's a solid route runner for his size. He can get downfield and win the one-on-one battles. So I think the fact that Dave Canales and this staff didn't lose sight of the fact that they still have to build around their number 1 overall pick quarterback, they did a fantastic job improving on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, I don't know if Carolina is quite ready for, like a playoff run yet, but they're getting there, man. I mean, we knew that this was going to be a multi-year rebuild, and we've talked about this before. Last year, everything that Carolina did was revolved around the question, is Bryce Young the guy? And that hit a major roller coaster or bump in the road or whatever you want to call it 2 games into the season when Bryce looked as bad as he did. You mentioned some of the stats of when he came back to be the starter, but this season the question still remains. So you got to make the defense a lot better. There's no question about that. But now you basically the same conversation that we had with the Arizona Cardinals, right? Cardinals and the Panthers sort of had similar offseason where they said, hey, let's get way better on the defense side of the ball when it comes to overall talent. We're not going to be worried about talent on that side of the ball. And then on the offensive side, it really is not that they haven't surrounded their quarterback with good options. I think that they have. It's a little bit of a different roster construction and what I like about Carolina versus what I like about the Cardinals. But you're just basically saying, is this quarterback good enough to elevate this roster the way that it is? Because if they are, we're going all in next season on the offensive additions, and we're going to start making our winning window and our playoff push wide open there. So Carolina, I thought, did a great job. Chicago Bears, I talked about how the only time that you get a plus is when you involve not only the roster getting better, but also the front office and the coaching staff. The Chicago Bears get an A+ from me for what they did this offseason. It starts with the coaching staff going out to get Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was the number 1 candidate for every single team in the NFL that had a head coach opening. Shoot, even for teams that maybe didn't have a head coach opening and were sort of on the fence about, maybe this guy's on the hot seat, maybe he's not. If they could have 1 in, 1 out for Ben Johnson, I think a good amount of teams would have done that as well. So he was the most coveted coach that we have seen in a long, long time. Chicago gets him, but even more than that, getting Dennis Allen to be your defense coordinator, absolutely love that. So I think that it was home run hires as the head coach, offensive mind, and then the defensive coordinator in Dennis Allen as well. This was already one of the better rosters in the NFL. They just disappointed in how they played last season. You add Joe Thuney, you had Drew Dahlman, and you add Jonah Jackson to that offensive line. And then you could throw in Ozzie Trapillo as well, who you just drafted as well. When you throw in what they did in free agency versus how they drafted, I mean, what they did in free agency allowed them to truly just draft best player available. That's how you get Colson Loveland and Luther Burden. That's how you get Ozzie Trapillo. That's how you get Shamar Turner. All of those guys there. They bring in Dayo Odeyingbo as well to be able to play on that edge spot. So I thought that they did just an excellent job of making this team even better. When you look at what their roster was last year, how it was a good roster, but just didn't play well, they've hit their roster weaknesses. They made their strengths even stronger, and they certainly did what they needed to do in the coaching staff to give them a lot of hope going into next year. So the Chicago Bears, A+ offseason for me. I understand, offseason champs last couple of years. I hear the jokes. I get it. They should be a force to be reckoned with even to get into the playoffs and win a couple of playoff games.
Yeah, no, Ben Johnson has come in and made it so that, look, Caleb Williams' life should be extremely easy. And you mentioned it. The reason that I didn't love their offseason last year is because I didn't love their offensive line. Now I have to love it, right? And you look at these 5 guys that they have. Braxton Jones, I'm going to say he comes back healthy. I'm not going to give Ozzie Trapillo the job yet, though it could happen. Braxton Jones, Joe Tooney, Drew Dahlman, Jonah Jackson, Darnell Wright. Those 5 guys, if you take their PFF grades and put them together, would grade at an 85.3 last year. If that were to hold for a whole season, that's the second best offensive line in football last year. So you're talking now about a team that had major problems on the interior, especially with pass protection, picking up blitzes and stunts, and the schemes weren't great either under the previous regime. This offensive line now has a chance to set them up, and we know Ben Johnson wants to run the ball first and foremost for a lot of success. And you add in Colson Loveland, Luther Burden, DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, Roma Dunze. They have endless possibilities on their offense, but it starts with the fact to me that they started it off fixing this offensive line first through free agency, through trades. I think every one of these guys is a spectacular fit. Now it's just on Caleb Williams and having to come down to execution and go out there one play at a time and make throws.
The Cincinnati Bengals, I gave them a C+ here. They were able to work things out with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, and I think that was what was most important, right? It's a key part of why you are winning football games. You have to be able to keep both of those guys and make them happy. That is how you have constructed the roster. Some people can sit here and say, like, okay, well, is that the best way to build a team? That's not really the question that you can ask of the Cincinnati Bengals at this point. This is how they've built their team. So their chips are on the table, if you will. You have to just maintain what you have here. Because if you were getting rid of one of those guys, I don't think how you have constructed this offense and how you've constructed this team works anymore. So independent of whether you agree with how they built their team and what they have emphasized, this is what they've done. So they need to keep both of those guys, and they need to figure out, how far it can take them really as they continue to build out the rest of the team. But the reason I gave it a C+ is because interior offensive line was a major issue for them last year. Did not really get better. Maybe you think it's an addition by subtraction by them no longer having Alex Kappa, but all of a sudden now you're asking Cody Ford or Dylan Fairchild to be a major upgrade for them at one of those guard spots. And that's even independent of the fact that, Ted Karras didn't play great last year. Cordell Volson really struggled at the other guard spots. So I'm worried about the interior offensive line for this team. And then in the front 7 as well, they got some new names in the front 7. TJ Slayton's here, obviously Shamar Stewart, who they drafted in the first round. The linebacker level, they're really hoping that Demetrius Knight can be a linebacker who can step in for them in his rookie season, but there's still just question marks. There's question marks about Demetrius Knight. There's question marks about Shamar Stewart and whether or not they're going to be able to produce the way that they need to, even in this first year. And so I still have some question marks about what they've done there. And then I like Lou Anarumo a lot. So losing Lou Anarumo and feeling like you have to fire him because of a lack of talent on the defensive side of the ball, in my opinion, I don't like the fact that he's no longer the defensive coordinator of this team. It felt like he was a scapegoat fire for just the team not playing well overall. I do like Al Golden. I'm interested to see how he is as a defensive coordinator. Obviously did a fantastic job with Notre Dame last season as their defensive coordinator. So it's not like, oh man, they lost Lou Anarumo. It's all negative. I do think that they gained some back because of the Al Golden hire, which I like. But I have a lot of respect for who Lou Anarumo is as a defensive mind in this league. And so I do think that it is a net negative as it stands right now. So Cincinnati did what they needed to do to bring back Higgins and Chase. But the fact of the matter is, you had those guys last year, and the season kind of was what it was. And I don't know how much better this team is this year compared to what they were last year with the changes in the coaching staff and then the changes in the roster as well. So I gave them the C+.
No, I agree. They don't look a whole lot better, and they're just kind of hoping guys are healthier and they get Burrow, Chase, and Higgins for as many weeks as possible. But the offensive line I would be worried about. You mentioned that guard spot. They were by far the worst guard unit in the league last year, especially in pass protection. So you look at it, and once again, Joe Burrow's going to have to get rid of the ball faster than anybody else and save himself out there. It's tough to do it week in and week out, and you look at the matchups and teams they have to play. Baltimore twice with all the guys they have. Pittsburgh with TJ Watt and those guys. Even Cleveland twice with Myles Garrett. Then you look at Kansas City and Chris Jones and all these other teams in the AFC. I think about the Houston Texans with the pass rush they have. This is still going to be a constant problem in Cincinnati, this offensive line. I don't know what offseason or when it's going to be that they're going to decide to fully go and just throw a bunch of resources at it as opposed to mid-rounders and, mid-level talents. Eventually, they have to protect Joe Burrow. And if they don't do it, I've said this before, teams with poor pass protection don't win Super Bowls. It just doesn't happen. And right now it looks like the Bengals are going to have that again.
We've got a super chat from QJ, a massive Panthers fan who's been with us all offseason. It feels like he's been rocking with us here on these shows and in the chat. So salute to you, QJ. Gives us a $5 super chat. Says, my Panthers win in the NFC South. Says Atlanta's trash. The Saints suck. Said Tampa's soft like Charmin toilet paper. Hold on now, QJ.
Wow, called you out. He called you right out there.
Hold on there.
That is...
I'm not standing for that. It says Bryce Young MVP season loading. I would love to see that for Bryce, honestly, just with the the comeback arc that he has there. I think the Carolina could absolutely finish the second best in that division. I don't think they're quite there with the Bucs yet, but again, like we were talking about in our section when we were going over the Panthers, they took a massive step in the right direction, right? Where I think that they're probably still second best in this division this upcoming year. I still think that the Bucs should be the heavy favorites coming as the incumbent division winners, and just the history that they have. How much I think that they continue to get better, and the roster is getting a little bit more well-rounded than even what it was last year. But a year from now, Bryce Young looks great, even if it's not MVP, QJ, even if Bryce Young looks great, like I said, they're going to hit the gas pedal on the offensive side of the football and then next offseason. And then we really get to have a debate of who's going to win and who's going to sort of be at the top of that division moving forward. And I think that that's exactly what Carolina would want. Walt is saying in the chat before we move on from Cincinnati, they also drafted Barrett Carter at the linebacker level. They did indeed. They also signed Orion Burks from the Philadelphia Eagles. So, hey, if one of those guys, a couple of those guys can really step up this season next to Logan Wilson, again, I think that front seven and that second level of their defense does look a lot better. But, it's a lot of in theory stuff with some newcomers and some rookies. Cleveland Browns, I gave the Cleveland Browns a C here for what they did this offseason. When you look at Cleveland, they made a change at offensive coordinator. Tommy Rees now the offensive coordinator there. Kevin Stefanski still the head coach. Jim Schwartz is still the defensive coordinator, so a little bit of a change there in the coaching staff. They re-signed Myles Garrett, which it's kind of hard to judge, like, okay, what do I really give that move? Because Myles Garrett was only leaving because you were going downhill as a franchise and things weren't going in the right direction. So to bring him back and to keep him on the roster and to not trade him and to sign him to a massive extension, like, okay, that's good, but a little bit of the same conversation that we just had with the Bengals. Does this make your team better? No, he was on the team last year. So it's a little bit of a wash, and he was only a threat to leave because of where the franchise currently was. I just don't really think that Cleveland did much better to be a better football team this upcoming year. So a lot of noise, a lot of conversations about the Cleveland Browns, but I don't have more faith in them now than I did, at this point last year. So I ended up giving the Cleveland Browns a C here.
No, I agree. They don't look a whole lot better, especially when you consider, some of the key positions on their team. The quarterback battle is wide open. We have no idea who's going to be their quarterback. At wide receiver, they added DeAndre Carter and Deontay Johnson, but to me, this is arguably the worst wide receiving core in the league right now. And then at cornerback, where they really struggled, they didn't really add much of anything of significance. And we're going to talk about, maybe for years on end, about whether they should have traded out of that Travis Hunter pick. And then you get into the draft, and I love Mason Graham. You add him to a D-line that could be a great unit, but you draft two quarterbacks in the mid-rounds. You draft two running backs, which they needed help at running back, but it's tough with some of the key spots on this team and the holes that they have, and where they struggled last year, it feels like they're going to struggle again, right? Offensive line, wide receiver, secondary, and of course, as always, quarterback, and that's going to be a circus throughout the whole summer. So, no, it's tough right now. Keeping Myles Garrett is big because, honestly, if I took this roster and took Myles Garrett off of it, I'm not sure they would win more than, 2 games? Myles Garrett in this D-line a lot of times is the reason that they win ball games. So, I understand having to keep him. He's arguably the best defensive player in football. But otherwise, especially offensively, I'm not sure where it goes from here in 2025.
For the Dallas Cowboys, I gave them a C+ here, which feels a little harsh given their draft, because I think their draft was absolutely fantastic. I gave them an A for what they were able to do, getting Tyler Booker, getting Donovan Izaraku, getting Savon Rebel. I thought it was a really great draft from the Dallas Cowboys. I don't really know what to think about Schottenheimer as the head coach. I think this grade really is sort of just a wait and see, depending on how good he is as a head coach, because it felt like Dallas was really dragging their feet with the head coach search and their head coach hire the whole time that they had an opening, or that they knew that they were going to have an opening. So it felt like they waited a really long time. I don't know if settle is the right word for Brian Schottenheimer. Because I just don't know how good he is going to be. If he turns out to be a great head coach, obviously they went about the process the right way and they got the right guy. But I'm a little skeptical of how long it took for them to get to this point, especially because they kind of figured that this might be coming. It's not like this was totally out of left field with McCarthy and certain, his situation and how it was talked about. So it's not like they were firing this guy out of nowhere with just a week or so left in the regular season. They kind of thought that this was a possibility, and it took them a long time to come to this decision. And to be honest, a lot of the other head coaching candidates out there were then already signed elsewhere by the time that they made this deal. So I don't really know what to think of the timeline. This one's sort of I didn't really know what to give that grade, because that matters so much to what the Dallas Cowboys did this offseason. They could have been a lot more active in free agency, and they were not. They brought back Osa Odigizua, which I think was good. He's a good player along their defensive line. But again, going back to some other conversations, does that make them better? No, you're just retaining a player who was part of a defensive line that just straight up was not good enough last year and needed upgrades. So you don't want to lose talented players. I still want to say, like, okay, good job bringing him back, but it felt like they were going to be a lot more involved in free agency, and they were not. And then you pair that with what was a really good draft. So what to think? I think the biggest area of concern or just unknown is what Schottenheimer's going to be as head coach. Because if he ends up being a bad head coach, man, then you really fumbled the head coaching cycle, and you really fumbled not being aggressive in free agency when you had the ability to do so. And this offseason could grade out much closer to a D or even an F, depending on what you think of the other head coaching candidates and how they perform and when they were available, when the Cowboys could have got interested in them. But I ended up giving them a C+. Very curious as to what you think about what Dallas did this offseason.
No, I think it's about right. I mean, it's kind of it's been the Cowboys' MO for the last decade that they actually draft pretty well. They don't have major issues drafting. It's that they don't spend any money in free agency, and they don't really, it feels like they never really have a plan to significantly improve in free agency. And I had the issue in free agency of we came out of it, and I just didn't think the run defense was much better than it was last year. Obviously, maybe Ezeraku in the draft gives you something off the edge. He had a couple of late round picks as well at D tackle, but I don't think they've done a whole lot of things significantly to improve the two things they needed to: the ability to run and the ability to stop the run. And when you're talking about especially stopping the run in a division where you play with Philadelphia and Washington, two of the best running teams in football, you need to be able to play to those matchups. You can't get run all over by these two teams or you won't stand a chance. So I think this offseason to me is going to be, the grade is going to eventually be determined by how much they can improve those two things. But on paper, they didn't significantly improve either of them, especially you look on the offensive side. Getting Tyler Booker's great, that helps, but this may be the weakest running back room in the league right now. Javonte Williams, Miles Sanders, Jaden Blue really isn't an every down option. I like him as a pass catcher. I like the occasional speed he can give you out of the backfield, but those are the questions I had coming into the offseason, and I still have them coming out of it.
Denver Broncos, I gave them an A here. This is one of the best defenses in the NFL last year, and they only got better, right? They hit the gas pedal to the floor with what they were going to be on the defense side of the football. No changes in the front office, no changes in the coaching staff, at least major changes. And so that is relatively the same. But bringing in Dre Greenlaw to help them out at the second level, and if there was any issues that this team might have had, it was probably team speed at the second level of their defense. And they get a guy who is absolutely has the juice in Dre Greenlaw when he is healthy. Talanoa Hufanga, kind of the same thing. A guy who could roam over the middle of the field, gives you that speed and ability to pursue the ball carrier at the second level, and as somebody who comes from downhill. So I absolutely love that as well. Jahdae Barron to play on the outside, that just makes their corner room even stronger. And then even in the draft, Savion Jones, Quay Robinson, I love those additions there to get ahead of some defensive line needs that they could potentially have next offseason when a couple of those guys hit unrestricted free agency. Bringing in RJ Harvey to be a potential RB1 for this team, bringing in Evan Ingram to be the tight end one of this team with his experience and what he could do as a receiver. I just love so much of what they did. The offensive line was already good enough. Bo Nix already played really well his rookie season. We'll see what he could be as a sophomore, whether it's taking a step forward or maybe a little bit of a step back. We will see. But, man, it's hard to not look at the Broncos and not really want to buy into exactly what they're doing. I think that the Broncos are going to be everybody's trendy pick to make the playoffs this year through a really tough division. And so I love what the Broncos did. I think that they got even better this offseason.
Yeah, not a huge quantity of moves, especially in free agency, but it feels like every move that they made was the right fit. You mentioned Greenlaw as a coverage linebacker. Hufanga is the box safety complement to Brandon Jones. Barron just makes their secondary better inside or outside, right? And then offensively, Evan Ingram at tight end in a room where they really needed needed some sort of spark at that spot. And I think behind this offensive line, I think R.J. Harvey's a dark horse Rookie of the Year candidate. I think he could have a huge year as the number one back in this offense that has balance and has a really good blocking unit up front. So I think you're right. Denver gets the A. They did a fantastic job.
Detroit Lions, I gave them a B- here. And a big part of why I gave them a B- is the fact that they lost both coordinators, right? They lose Aaron Glenn, they lose Ben Johnson. Now, I wonder if B- is a little bit harsh because that's not really their fault, right? I mean, like, they just had such great coordinators that they lost both of those guys to be head coaches elsewhere in the league. But it's hard to look at that situation and feel great about it, right? You're losing Ben Johnson, you're losing Aaron Glenn, and so I do have to ding them for that, whether it was a big thing that was their fault or not, which I don't think that it was. You just look at how the offseason went, and it didn't go well for them in terms of losing your two-star coordinator. So I bring them down a little bit for that. You're basically subbing out on the roster Carlton Davis for DJ Reed, which I think is an upgrade, so I think they get some points back for that. I thought the draft was solid for them. We've had the conversation about whether or not the Tesla move was right, giving up everything that they did to jump up in the third round to take him. Obviously that's paying a pretty penny, but Brad Holmes has done pretty well in the draft over the last couple of years, so you can give him the benefit of the doubt until it does not work. So I thought it was a solid draft. Whatever we ended up giving, I think we gave their draft a B+. I don't mind the fact that they upgraded a little bit at cornerback, so there's a little bit of a marginal gain there, but I just think losing the two coordinators it's tough. I think that's got the potential to really hurt this team, and it wasn't just the coordinators, it was some of the assistant coaches as well. So ultimately I gave this one a B-. I didn't want to be too harsh on the fact that they lost their coordinators because, again, that's not necessarily their fault, but when you do look at what happened to the Lions and their team and their organization right now versus last year, I do think it was a little bit of a step down and a lot more uncertainty going into this year. Not that the Lions can't handle it, not that I don't still think they're one of the best teams in the NFL. It just wasn't a great offseason for them, whether how much of it was their fault or just natural for how good their guys were, and they were eventually going to get poached.
Yeah, I think the Lions season comes down to two things when it comes to competing for a Super Bowl. One is the two coordinators, John Morton and Kelvin Shepard, like you mentioned, and two, the health of the defensive line. Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, they need the stars on this D-line to be stars. Now, they have a good depth now at defensive tackle. They drafted Tyleik Williams in the first round, but they didn't really add another impact edge rusher alongside Aiden Hutchinson. So there's a lot of it that's going to come down to Hutchinson because the second he got hurt last year, this defense got significantly worse. They need him to come back healthy and to be the best pass rusher in football like he was the first 5-6 weeks of last year.
Yep, I do agree with you. I think that who Hutchinson is when he comes back from this injury will be huge for this team, because if he's anything like what he looked like last season, they will be fine. But if he is not, that drop-off is steep, and we saw that last year. And I think the big worry becomes if Hutchinson lost any sort of juice or flexibility with that injury, and he comes back, and now you have to worry about, okay, well, now there's not this like hope in the distance. There's not this, well, when Hutchinson comes back, if he comes back and he is not, I don't want to say exactly what he was last year, because that was crazy production, but even like close to it, just the dominant edge one player that they need him to be, then you start getting really worried because they do not have that player that can really be a takeover guy along that defensive line. And I think that you can start getting worried about what they're going to be against the better against the better teams in the NFL on their journey to the Super Bowl, which is the aspirations that they still have. Green Bay Packers, I gave them a C- here for their offseason. Nate Hobbs, Aaron Banks were their two big free agency ads. Interesting players to prioritize, but I do feel like both of those guys were overpays. I think the draft could be nice for them, but again, it's a draft with a lot of unknown, okay? Like Anthony Belton. I like Anthony Belton as a player. Does he work out exactly the way you want him to with who you have on the offensive line, with Aaron Banks now in the mix? Like, does Jordan Morgan kick out the offensive tackle? Do you feel great about that? Is that the move that you wanted to make when you drafted him all along? What happens with Aaron Banks and Anthony Belton with like where these two guys play? What's the long-term play look? Savion Williams is your third draft pick. What is Savion Williams for you? He was one of the most unique players in this draft, and I feel like they need him to be an impact player, especially as a receiver. Can he be that? I obviously like the Matthew Golden deal there, but I'm worried about corner, right? There was talks of them being frustrated with Jair Alexander and how much time he has missed over the last couple of years. And it looks like he's going to stay on the team, because if he would have gotten traded, it felt like he would have been traded already. So it looks like you're going to go into next season with Jair Alexander, which I actually like, but that still brings question marks of, this is somebody who's missed a lot of time due to injury over the last couple of years. Are you worried about durability concerns for him? So a lot of moves for the Packers, but in my opinion, there's a lot of unknown on this team. And even for a good chunk of the free agency money that they spent, what they did in the draft, not moving on from Jair Alexander, it doesn't make me feel a lot better about the Packers. There's a way where certainly they could be a better football team, but this division is still going to be incredible. And I have more question marks for the Packers than I wish I had going into the season, knowing how good their division should be this upcoming year. So ultimately, a lot of moves, but not a lot of moves that I'm super confident and can point to and say, yes, the Packers absolutely got better here. So I gave them a C-.
I think you said it absolutely right. Does it, when you try to project and predict things going into a season, you look for what's stable. You look for things you absolutely know, right? Like when let's say we're predicting the Baltimore Ravens. You go, well, we know Lamar Jackson's elite or something like that. It's easy to figure out. With the Packers, it feels like there's so much that's conditional, right? It's, can Jordan Love get back to 2023? Is Matthew Golden the deep threat they need? Can they figure out whatever's going on in the offensive line? Is Lucas Van Ness going to break out in year 3? Is Jair Alexander healthy? It feels like there's just so many questions, and some things will obviously go right, but there's so much right now looking at the Packers that feels like their success is conditional on so many things that you do wonder if they start to lag behind the rest of the division. And look, the Bears have a lot of conditionals, a lot of new pieces, the Vikings with J.J. McCarthy, but it feels like the Packers, we look at a lot of areas of their team and we go, if this happens, maybe, but there's a lot of this that didn't happen last year, and they won a lot on, Jeff Hafley calling the right defense and Josh Jacobs mowing people down in the run game, but there are flaws on this Packers team that I'm worried about, and you mentioned that. I don't know that they've gotten significantly better with just about any of them, unless I think Matthew Golden is the big piece here that can open up this offense and make Jordan Love a lot better than he was and get back to that 2023 form, but there's a lot of questions with the Packers right now, and I'm curious to see how they get answered early in the season.
The Houston Texans, I gave them a pretty low grade here. I gave them a D for their offseason. Now, they move on from Larry Tunsil, and they do so, and the report kind of comes out that he wasn't exactly the culture fit that they wanted or the guy leading their offensive line room. I can't really speak to that. All I can speak to is their offensive line was bad last year. Tunsil was basically the only one who was good for them, and you traded him. So now it's a ton of new names on the offensive line, but like we've talked about in our draft grades episode for them, the free agency grades episodes that we did earlier this offseason, it's to be seen whether or not the new names are actually going to pan out. And if they get a solid starting 5 out there with the 12 potential names that they have to start, okay, like then it worked out for them. But on the surface level, you traded your best offensive lineman at a time where you really should not be doing that. So you've got to feel great about the fact that you made this move for a culture move. They move on from Bobby Slowick as well, their offensive coordinator, which, as much as I do think that like Bobby Slowick can be a good offensive coordinator in this league, I can get it just because the offensive line took such a step back in C.J. Stroud's second year. I think that unfortunately somebody kind of has to be a scapegoat there. That's just the nature of the NFL business. So I'm not too negative on that. I thought the draft was good, especially at receiver. I think that they got better with their offensive weapons. Again, they added some more names to the offensive line. But really, Dalton, the offensive and defensive lines, specifically the interior defensive line, I have major question marks about both of those areas about this team, and I don't want to be having those question marks of a team that is going into year 3 of CJ Stroud's rookie contract, because you are now halfway through his rookie contract, which we say all the time is the most valuable thing in sports. And I just don't feel like they're going in the right direction with 2 very pivotal parts of why you're a great football team, and that's in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line. So I just don't think that they got better in those areas. In fact, I think they got worse. And for that, I gave them a D grade for their offseason.
No, I agree with that. It wasn't a good one. Trading away Laramie Tunsil when your pass blocking stats are already that bad, like we saw on the screen, is a problem. That's going to be the question. I think a lot like Cincinnati and Joe Burrow. Can you protect your quarterback enough? Because he's certainly good enough to take you a long way, right? So the Texans are in a weird spot because right this minute, I would probably still pick them to win this division because they have the quarterback and their pass defense is so good. And I like the fact that they attacked the weaponry in the draft, getting Jaden Higgins, getting Jalen Noel. I think that's going to really help them long term as they try to build this offensive line in the future. But it feels like they can absolutely win this division. And for those two reasons you just mentioned, the O-line and the D-line, it feels like they just can't win a Super Bowl as they're constructed right now, right? And it's just, and the run blocking too. I mean, are they going to be able, kind of like Dallas, to run and stop the run enough with these two units so they can get into, okay, CJ Stroud in the passing game, they can get into, when they're in obvious passing situations, this defense is an absolute problem with their edge rushers and their secondary, but it's the meat and potatoes of this team that you worry about, especially when you get into the cold weather when trenches and trench play wins ball games.
For the Indianapolis Colts, I was kind of torn on this because, you do offseason grades based on, expectations of what teams potentially had to do, right? Salary cap space, were you going to make changes at certain positions, like where you were picking in the draft, all that kinds of stuff. So you have to take expectation into account here for the Colts. Ultimately, I was all over the place between B minus, B plus. I didn't really know where to lean for the Colts because they lose Ryan Kelly and they lose Will Fries, and that's tough. But they have Tanner Bortolini, they have Matt Goncalves, who they've drafted, and perhaps they feel good about starting in those spots. And then the secondary, I think that they needed upgrades in the secondary, and they bring in Cam Bynum, and they bring in Charvarius Ward, who I think are two excellent additions for them in this team. I also really liked how they drafted, right? They bring in Tyler Warren, they bring in JT Tuimoloau, they bring in Justin Wally, who I think could, again, be a secondary upgrade for them in the long term. The receiver room was already great. They've already got good running backs there. They draft DJ Giddens as well, who I think only makes that better. They brought in Daniel Jones, and they brought in Riley Leonard. So in terms of what the Colts could do, I think this grade fluctuates between a B plus to a B minus, depending on what you think of their offensive line and how much faith they have in those young guys. Because if you don't have faith in the young guys, then I think that you look at Will Fries, even though he's coming off the injury, and Ryan Kelly, who's been there for a long time, and you think that they got worse in an area where they really need to be better as they're trying to figure out who their starting quarterback is moving forward. But they got a lot better in the secondary, which I think they needed. I think they're fine subbing in Jalen Carlies for EJ Speed, letting him walk in free agency. I think the defensive line is going to be pretty stout for them. We already know the pass catchers are good. They only got better with Tyler Warren there now as their potential tight end one, I should say. Quarterback's a question mark, but quarterback was kind of always going to be a question mark, right? You could say they're going to go into next season with Anthony Richardson. That's bad. But what else were they going to do? Their hands are kind of tied. You drafted this guy 6 overall. You kind of have to just give him this year. So I don't necessarily want to sit here and say, going into next season with Anthony Richardson is a big failure from them. Because, again, they did sign Daniel Jones. They did draft Riley Leonard. I don't know how realistic it would have been to think that they would have done more than that. So, based on realistic expectations, I ended up giving the Colts a B plus because of, I thought, how well they drafted, how they got better in the secondary, and how they were at least able to mitigate some of the offseason losses at the offensive line with young guys that they already have on the roster, and they're not calling on rookies to be able to start right away. So I gave a B+, but very curious as to how you viewed the Colts offseason.
No, I think the offensive line, they do have faith in those young guys, especially inside. Tanner Bortolini, you mentioned Dalton Tucker got a lot of playing time last year, right guard as well. I think they believe in those guys, and they generally have a pretty good offensive line anyway. You still have stars like Bernard Ryman and Quentin Nelson on the other side. They kept Braden Smith around for one more year, so I think they could be fine there. I like the additions in the secondary, especially Charvarius Ward, and the fit in Lou Anarumo's defense, and I think that's an upgrade at defensive coordinator too with Anarumo coming in there. You mentioned Cincinnati losing. Well, the Colts are getting a good one in Anarumo, and then to me the best thing that happened for him that would make this a B+ is Tyler Warren falling to them at 14 when this was one of the worst tight end groups in the league over the last couple years. He's the perfect player for Shane Steichen's offense. He can play the Dallas Goedert after the catch role. Tyler Warren I would say he was the best tight end in the country last year. I know Harold Fannin had all the numbers down there at Bowling Green and the MAC, but Tyler Warren was the best tight end in the country, proving he can be the centerpiece of an offense. I think Steichen's Jordan's going to absolutely love him. This is the guy that he wanted the entire time. When you go back and look at the way in the RPO game that he used to use Dallas Goedert in Philadelphia, I think that's what he wants to do with Warren, and Warren could even be better at it.
The Jacksonville Jaguars, I gave them a B- here. Again, it's a little bit of the beauty is in the eye of the beholder with some of the changes that they made. Major changes to the front office and the head coaching staff. Now, I don't know necessarily what to think about Liam Cohen and James Gladstone. I think that the Liam Cohen hire is a good one because I think he's a really good play caller in this league, and I think he's really going to help Trevor Lawrence out. So, again, in theory, I do like that move. I also like the Doug Peterson move when it happened, and obviously that did not work out. But I do still like the Liam Cohen move. I like that that's the guy that they went after and prioritized at head coach there, outside of Ben Johnson, who I'm sure that they would have loved to get. James Gladstone, we'll see. With him being with the Rams organization and now getting his shot to be a general manager here in the NFL, makes a major splash and getting aggressive to go up and get Travis Hunter in his first draft. But when it comes to free agency, I thought the free agency additions were interesting with their priority. They go out and they get Jordan Lewis. They go out and they get Eric Murray. The safety room just was not good enough, so you're sort of subbing Eric Murray in for Andre Cisco, who you let walk. I think that's fine. It's a little bit of a one in, one out, in my opinion, but I was a little bit higher on Cisco than I think other people, so maybe some people see that as a major upgrade. I don't necessarily see it like that, but I could understand where people are coming from. The signing of Jordan Lewis is very interesting to me. And then, Caleb Ransaw, it sort of depends on where they believe that he's going to play. He played a lot of slot at Tulane. Maybe he plays as a strong safety. Maybe he ends up taking Darnell Savage's job, which Darnell Savage was one of the lowest graded players in football last year. And so that could be a possibility there. Maybe they do have two new starting safeties. I get worried about Jerry Jones playing as an outside corner because it looks like he's going to play outside corner for them. I thought he played well in the slot last year. He played well in the slot in his last year at Florida State. And by signing Jordan Lewis, I think you're pushing him to the outside. And Jerry Jones really struggled as an outside corner during his first two seasons at Florida State before they moved him into the slot spot. So I think that's a little bit of a risk there, but maybe Travis Hunter's getting involved at the cornerback position as well. So secondary did get upgrades there. But it's just, I think the way that they went to prioritize things, I thought the draft was good, but it really just kind of depends on what you think of the James Gladstone and Liam Cohen hiring. So again, one of those, it's a little bit of the same conversation that I had with the Indianapolis Colts. I gave him a B-, you give him a B, you give him a B+. I think I'd be okay with any of those moves. But there is some sort of bets that how they made those bets in the secondary. It's like, okay, I'm very interested to see if this works out for you, because part of it, I think, is a little bit of a square peg in a round hole, but we'll see if they know their roster better than we do here sitting on the outside. But B- for the Jags. What'd you think?
I think there will be a big TBD on this grade, and I think it just comes down to Travis Hunter. I really do. I think the story of this offseason is making the bold trade up, trading next year's first-round pick for Travis Hunter. What are they going to do with him? Will it be both ways? He's going to be a wide receiver first. They've made that pretty clear to pair him with Brian Thomas Jr. And look, all the great teams and the great offenses in this league have multiple weapons, many of them with two big-time threats as a receiver. And look, most people thought, okay, he'll play corner and he'll moonlight as a receiver, but this is what you're getting if you play him at receiver. Guy with the 7th best receiving grade in the country last year, 2nd in touchdowns, tied for a perfect 99.9 deep receiving grade, 24 missed tackles forced, even though he was playing over, I think it was 1,400 snaps combined on both sides of the ball. So, I mean, you're talking about a guy who, if he just played wide receiver, he could be the best receiver coming out of this draft. He's an absolute freak of nature. Maybe he does play on defense a little bit, but it's this entire offseason to me, it's just going to come down to the bold move that this team made to trade up for Travis Hunter and basically pin all of their hopes on him in this draft. It's something that's going to be so much fun to watch for the next few years. And I mean, that's all we can think about is if Trevor Lawrence gets right, if the pass protection is right, he's got Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter to throw to. That could be as dynamic as any receiver pair in the league.
Yeah, the Travis Hunter move, maybe I should have just given that a B+ for that alone, because I love the aggressiveness to go up and get the best player in the draft. So maybe I'm changing this in my head as we're talking about it here to a B+ instead of a B-. Kansas City Chiefs are the next team that I have here. I give them an A-. Losing Joe Thuney, obviously not ideal, but figuring out how to bring back Trey Smith, obviously through the franchise tag, figuring out how to bring back Nick Bolton. I think both of those moves were great. Jalen Moore's an overpay at offensive tackle. At least it's some insurance there. I thought the draft was very fantastic for them. I thought it was very Chiefs-esque. Now, they lose a lot on the interior defensive line, and so, again, I fluctuated between a B+ and an A- here because I think that is a major issue for them moving forward. But I think that they're trying to do things along the offensive line. Again, it was good to bring back the guys they brought back. They're in a Super Bowl window, obviously, coming up just short of a three-peat last season. And I thought the draft was fantastic for them in the short and long term. So ended up going with an A- here for the Kansas City Chiefs, who Brett Veach continues to do a great job as their general manager there. What'd you think?
I could agree with that. I mean, I think the big thing I look at is their draft class, right? I think there's just a lot of players that I really like, and the more I look at them, you go, oh man, these are Kansas City Chiefs. For Sir Josh Simmons, they needed talent on the offensive line. A guy like Ashton Gelati, Noel Williams, a lot of their mid-round picks, even all the way down to the 7th round in Brashard Smith, who I think, you know me, I love him. I think he could contribute early as a receiving back. So it felt like a quieter kind of offseason from the Chiefs and trying to figure out who's staying and who's going, and then having another good draft class. But that's why they stay good, right? I mean, they just keep rotating talent in there, and it seems to continue to work. So I don't think they're going to have many issues, and I think a big factor for next season is that Rashee Rice is going to be coming back healthy. I think this receiving core, we forget when Rice is healthy how good it can be. So maybe they're transitioning a bit away from Travis Kelce, but you got Rashee Rice coming back. You got Jalen Royals, a talented player in the 5th round. You got Brashard Smith in the backfield. I think this passing game is actually going to look better this season than it did last year.
All right, halfway through our off-season grades here for every team in the NFL here. But now it's time to talk to all the parents out there. Ask them a question: what does your child's future success look like for them? Maybe it's them getting to travel the world. Maybe it's them owning their own business. Then maybe it's them just having their own house, living a comfortable life. Whatever it is, you can help them achieve that right now with a kids investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kids investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Whole thing is online. Setting up an account could take you as little as just 5 minutes, and then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Starts with just $20, no contribution limits to it. Tax advantages, funds your SIPC insured up to $500,000. Plus, there is no commission fees on it. It's just a low, flat monthly maintenance fee. Funds, it's not just when they're older either. I mean, you can use this account and help them out while they're kids. You know, tuition, music classes, tutors, sporting events, whatever. And then when they are adults, maybe it is helping them start their first business, buy their first house, get their first car, whatever it is. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family and start investing in your child's future today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL, MEET. Fabric.com/PFFNFL. The portfolios are managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors Incorporated. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. You can learn more at meetfabric.com. Raiders, A- from me here for the Las Vegas Raiders. Love the hirings, I should say, of both Pete Carroll and John Spytek. I think that's a major plus for them. Love the aggressiveness for the Geno Smith trade. Really did love those moves. Now, you lost Robert Spillane. You lost Trayvon Merrick. You brought in a couple of new flyer free agents. You got Eric Stokes. You got Alex Kappa. You got Jeremy Chin. You got Devin White. I thought the draft was absolutely excellent. A- honestly might be a little bit harsh when I throw in the hirings that they made because I love them so much, and I really like the move to go get Geno Smith. This could have been a straight A, but there were a couple of things that I thought, okay, well, you lost a couple of guys who were really good on that defensive side of the ball and didn't exactly replace them in the one-to-one with some of the free agents that you have. Maybe they weren't going to do that overall. Maybe it's an addition by subtraction, not having Jack Jones in that secondary either, but I still have major secondary concerns for this team, especially at outside corner, and so that's why I couldn't fully give them an A, but I did love a lot of what the Raiders did this offseason.
No, I think an A- is perfect. I think you mentioned the back seven of the defense is something they just, they couldn't address a ton. They tried to get some quantity in there. You mentioned Stokes and Chin, and I think adding Darian Porter in the draft in the 3rd round is a really good move too. But look, this team is going to look better just because they have a better quarterback, and I think people still kind of underrate the way Geno Smith played the last 3 years. He was a top 10 quarterback during his time in Seattle. 8th best passing grade in football, best deep passing grade, 5th in big-time throw rate. The Raiders over the last 2 years since Derek Carr left, 24th or worse in all those categories you see on the screen there. So I just think the fact that they have a more than competent quarterback in there on top of a much more than competent running back in Ashton Jeanty, their 1st-round pick, taking over in a backfield that ranked last in the league in rushing grade, this offense is going to be a real threat to a lot of teams. I think the back seven could see them getting in a lot of shootouts, but I think offensively they're going to look miles better than they have the last couple years.
Walt also pointing out Chip Kelly of course, the offensive coordinator.
And a great play caller.
I do like that hire as well. So that is also a plus to what the Raiders were able to do this offseason. And get Tom Brady as a minority owner. Not bad. Maybe I should just give it an AA plus for what they did on the back end of things in the front office and in the ownership. Los Angeles Chargers. I gave the Chargers a C plus, which might sound a little bit harsh here, but my reasoning for it is they had a lot of money to spend in free agency, really didn't. Waited a while on the offensive line market, ended up bringing in Mekhi Becton, who, okay, in theory, that's fine. I like that along the offensive line, but they waited a long time to do so. I thought there was going to be a lot more in terms of defensive line splashes when it came to free agency. They're losing Poona Ford from this team. Again, maybe it's an addition by subtraction, not having Joey Bosa there because he just wasn't worth the contract that you were paying him. But I still think the talent along the defensive line, you're losing some talent there, which is not ideal. I thought you could have been maybe more aggressive in how you were upgrading the offensive line. That just didn't happen. Maybe with the receiver market as well, there wasn't that. They signed Najee Harris, who at the time, when we're given like free agency grades, you go, okay, you had a running back need. You go get Najee Harris. Not bad. That's fine. All right, we'll give you a decent grade for that. But now that you drafted a running back in the first round, now I think it's a little redundant. And now I go back to it and I go, okay, you didn't make as many moves as I thought you were going to make. You didn't really spend as much money as I thought you were going to spend. And some people might look at that and say, hey, they weren't just going to spend money to spend money. I understand that. That's also a good business practice when you're running a team. So I totally understand that. You don't have to go to the cap floor every single time. But of the money they did choose to spend, now it's a little bit redundant in what they were able to do. Because if you're going to draft the running back in the first round, obviously you want that player to be a 3-down back for you. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to be a 3-down back this upcoming season, but you guys kind of get where I'm going. I felt like the Chargers could have made more of a splash this offseason and really hit the gas pedal for a good year last year in year one of Jim Harbaugh. And I didn't feel like it was this massive leap into what I now think of the Chargers. I still think the Chargers are a good team, can absolutely be a playoff team this upcoming season. I got a lot of faith in the coaching staff, got a lot of faith in the roster as it stands. But I felt like they could have been better given the expectations of what they had to deal with the draft and the salary cap that they had available to them. And instead, I think they lost a little bit more talent than I thought they were going to lose. I thought they were going to bring back Poona Ford. They do not. And so ultimately, I ended up with a C+, even though I did like the Chargers draft.
It feels like a team that is so far, because they know where they were coming from when they started this project last year, that they're just a little wary of diving in head first, right? And there's always that thing where if you dive head first into a pool that's too shallow, you're going to hit your head on the bottom too, right? So I think they're still taking a slower approach of trying to build through the draft and create a sustainable contender, as opposed to, not that Denver isn't doing that, but let's say Denver made a couple more head first moves, especially spending $15 a year on a guy like Dre Greenlaw, who's really didn't play at all last year, right? Coming off an Achilles tear and making some other moves in the draft to try to spruce up this defense, and then trusting RJ Harvey with the running back thing. I think Denver dove in a little more head first, whereas the Chargers taking the more conservative approach, trying to go with the draft and develop approach, and then eventually we'll see them get aggressive. But it is interesting, the two different mindsets to me of two rivals in this division who are very much in the same place with their football teams.
Yeah, who was saying this in the chat? Oh, Kevin was saying in the chat, like, okay, well, who are they going to go for on the defensive line? Again, I wouldn't have let Poona Ford leave. Like, straight up, would not have let him leave. And if you were going to let him leave, I would have brought in somebody like Bobby Brown. I would have brought in somebody like Calais Campbell if you kind of got him to come over. Now he goes to the Cardinals, so maybe it's a little bit just like, hey, it's like a homecoming for him. He's probably going to retire soon. I can understand that one. But Deshaun Wharton went for a little bit more than they thought, so maybe they were involved in that market, and he just ended up going for more money than they thought was going to be the case. Perhaps they could have been in the Milton Williams conversation as well. But ultimately, I just look at, Javon Hargrave, Bobby Brown, Poona Ford, not letting him leave. Like, that's what I would have done for this team. And I just don't think the interior defensive line is better. And they had the money, in my opinion, to make it better. Now, again, I want to be fair and say, hey, if they had value for these certain players and they ended up going for higher value, you don't have to go to the cap floor every single time. But I think the team had a little bit of an up and down with, I think that they got more talented in some areas, but I think they took a step down, and for as much as they had to spend in the cap space, and then obviously letting a player who was there already in Poona Ford, I feel like you should have had the advantage of bringing him back. So I don't love the fact that that happened. And then obviously, like I talked about with the Najee Harris move, and its redundancy now with Omarion Hampton as your first round pick. Rams are the next team here. I gave the Rams an A-. Bringing back Stafford, I think, was huge for them because I think they're in a winning window right now. And if you lose Stafford, if he ends up going to the New York Giants, you're screwed. You don't have anything there. I think that you totally have to return the roster sooner than you wanted to. So I think that bringing him back was actually huge. So it's one of those moves where it's like, yeah, I'm not trying to talk about this differently than, the even grade or positive or negative that I gave the Browns for bringing back Myles Garrett and the Bengals for bringing back their two receivers. But I think there was a genuine threat that Stafford leaves. And if Stafford leaves, I think it changes everything. So I actually do want to give them a positive here for being able to bring Stafford back and extending that winning window. You've talked about how much you like bringing back Alaric Jackson from this team. They replaced Cooper Kupp with Devontae Adams, which I think was a plus. They brought in Poona Ford, which I think was really nice for their defensive line that is young, and I think they are playing really well overall. I thought they drafted decently well with a smaller class. They ended up trading back in the first round and got a couple of extra picks. Didn't really address linebacker, didn't really address corner. I'm a little bit worried about that for them. For that, maybe I could have given them a little bit less of a grade here, but this offseason was all about making sure that they bring Matthew Stafford back. They were able to replace, again, Cooper Kupp with somebody that allows them to keep their offense pretty stout. And then drafting Terrence Ferguson, I thought there was an overdraft for where I had him in the rankings, but again, being in the winning window the way that they are, I can understand them wanting to prioritize somebody who could be a full-time tight end and somebody who brings that receiving ability. So a little worried about the fact that they didn't address linebacker and corner. There's no doubt that's the case. Perhaps I should have given them something more in the B range because of that, but clearly they're okay with the guys that they have on the roster there, and I do like some of the changes that they were able to make, even though it was a little bit of a smaller splash.
Yeah, coverage is going to be the question for them, right? I think you mentioned it, linebacker out there at corner too, but I think in the context of all of these moves, Adams is a great move. Keeping Alaric Jackson, I love. I even like bringing in Coleman Shelton to compete at center, somebody they're familiar with as a veteran. Bo Limmer did a decent job for him last year, but I think to get more stability on the inside, especially when you have a quarterback like Stafford, is great. And I think the context of all the moves they made, and then getting Atlanta's first-round pick next year to set yourself up for the future if Stafford retires after this year, if you want to have an understudy, if he stays for another year, however that goes with next year's quarterback class, I think they really set themselves up well. They balanced the here and now with the future, and I think Sean McVay and Les Snead are doing a great job of probably transitioning themselves into the next era. They're going to try to compete this year, but that extra first-round pick is really going to help them next year.
Miami Dolphins, I gave the Dolphins a C here. I have just not loved what the Dolphins have really done over the last two off seasons. I think they are getting worse as a team, and I think that their winning window is continuing to close even more. They lost Javon Holland, never felt like he was returning, which is sort of interesting. That we were almost never entertaining the fact that he was going to go back to Miami, which I think is a little bit of a revelation there in and of itself. The Ramsey trade talks, and then the secondary sort of being what it is. Tyreek Hill, the big unknown, right? Is he going to ask for a trade? Is he not? Like, I think that that's not great that you have those two guys in Ramsey and Tyreek Hill who have flirted with demanding with trades and wanting out of Miami. That's not ideal. They did sign James Daniels, which I want to give them credit for, and they invested in the offensive defensive lines, which I, again, want to give them credit for. I just don't really look at Miami and think that this team is better. I think that whatever is going on there for your star players to want to leave, that's not an ideal situation, whether it was Javon Holland or whether it was the two guys that are still there in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey. I just don't think that the Miami Dolphins are really getting better. And I think that the moves that they made here this offseason are simply a reaction to them not addressing the offensive and defensive trenches the way they needed to last year. Now, that doesn't mean I want to punish them for doing it this year. I talked about that in their draft grades. So maybe you could go a little bit higher with this grade because of it. But I just feel so apathetic and with this Miami Dolphins team. Like, I genuinely think that the Patriots could very well finish second in this division over the Miami Dolphins this upcoming season. It's just hard for me to look at this team and have faith in what they're going to do in 2026. And I think in 2025, and if they struggle in what is going to happen here in 2025, are you in for a full sale rebuild? Like, are we changing things in the front office, the coaching staff, the quarterback situation, everything? And is Miami closer to a rebuild than it is to actually contending? So we will see this upcoming season, but I still don't feel better about the Miami Dolphins than I did going into this offseason. So I gave C.
There are multiple problems here. The first one to me is when you talk about Ramsey and Hill and potential trade talks, they have significant contracts that they have also. So I don't know that you're getting a whole lot back for either of those guys just because of the cap situation and what another team would be taking on. The other thing, too, look, we can talk secondary, we can talk linebackers, D-line, all this other stuff, but at the end of the day, this team has had issues protecting Tua and keeping Tua healthy, and losing Teron Armstead That's a major blow because we've already seen when Armstead is off the field, they get significantly worse up front. And you look at this being in some order their projected offensive line for this year. Aaron Brewer, a 70 pass blocking grade, and that's the best one. Daniels, 66.5, but he only played a couple games last year coming off a torn Achilles. Jackson and Paul, 60 and 55.8, and Savaianea, 82.7 last year at Arizona, but he's probably going to play guard for this team, and he didn't play a single snap at guard last year. He's done it in the past, but now he's going to have to move inside and learn at left guard, most likely with Patrick Paul as the left tackle. So if this team specifically has major issues in pass protection, we're just going to be doing, again, what we've been doing what seemingly for Tua's whole career, and that's just they can't drop back and throw the football. They have to get rid of it quickly with RPOs and play action and things like that. And Tua just has not proven, even since his time in Alabama, that he can stay on the field and stay healthy if he's taking hits. So I'm really worried first and foremost about this offensive line and how they're going to pass protect.
For the Vikings, I went back and forth between a B+ and an A- here. I think to not lose anyone in the coaching staff after the year that they had was excellent, right? I mean, you win 14 games, and normally somebody's getting poached, right? And so to bring back the entire staff, I think was huge for them. Love what they did in free agency. I thought they really hit the gas pedal in free agency, bringing in Ryan Kelly, bringing in Will Fries, bringing in John Allen, bringing in Javon Hargrave, like all of those dudes. Yeah, they were replacing players in the secondary, but they were able to bring back Cam Bynum, which I think was huge for them as their best secondary player. Not Cam Bynum, Byron Murphy, which was their best secondary player last season, or their best cornerback last season, I should say. So I love what they were able to do there. The draft, underwhelming for me. Again, not trading back from number 24. Now they get Donovan Jackson, and like you said, if Donovan Jackson is the final piece for them being a top 3 offensive line in the NFL, probably worth it, right? But then their draft after that, I like Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, but I did not love drafting another wide receiver the back end of the third round when you didn't have a lot of picks anyway. So I might be a little bit harsher on the draft than I should be. And so again, B+, A-. Yeah, you lose Sam Darnold, but the way that he played the last 2 games of the season, including that last game in the playoffs, you feel okay about that, especially that you drafted J.J. McCarthy to be able to take over anyway. So I don't really see that as a negative with them losing Sam Darnold. I felt like that was the play for them all along. So instead, I just think that they got better in both trenches, and this team is going to continue to be a force. Now, win 14 games again? Probably not, just because I think the division is going to continue to get better, and winning 14 games, I mean, you got to have the ball bounced the right way. Not that you don't earn those, but you got to have the ball bounced the right way to win that many games as well. So double-digit wins for Minnesota. Could absolutely see that once again. They're still a really good football team, even with all the changes. So ultimately, with what they did in free agency, how they kept around the coaching staff, even factoring in the unknown of the quarterback change, I ended up giving them a B+. What'd you think of Minnesota?
This season, it's going to be about J.J. McCarthy. They're going to have a good defense with Brian Flores still calling the plays. They're going to have a good offensive line, especially as long as Christian Darrisaw gets back healthy from the torn ACL, and Donovan Jackson in there at left guard right next to him. You mentioned Will Fries has to be healthy as well at right guard. But I think when you look at, and I've said this with several teams now, I think there's a lot of teams, at least a half dozen of them, that did a great job just surrounding their quarterback with the right type of talent. I think the Vikings have done the same thing here with J.J. McCarthy, especially with Kevin O'Connell calling the plays. So it's really what it's going to be about, more so than wins and losses. And look, this team can still absolutely make the playoffs. They won 14 games last year. Obviously, a lot of one-score wins in there, but they could make the playoffs. They could even have a chance to win this division if McCarthy pans out early. But it's really more importantly going to be about J.J. McCarthy's development and just getting him on the field for essentially what's going to be his rookie season.
The New England Patriots, another A+ here, right? I think it has to be. I mean, you moving on from the unknown and the disappointment that was Gerard Mayo, and I get it. His only year as a head coach, and perhaps didn't get the fair shot that he deserved. But when you have a guy like Mike Vrabel that's sitting out there, you could bring back Josh McDaniels, who has obviously had so much success as an offensive coordinator with this team. Major upgrades in the coaching staff, proven guys that have won in this league and know what they're doing. So I think that's a major upgrade there. And then you just look at what they did in free agency and in the draft. I mean, this was one of the worst rosters in the NFL, and all of a sudden you're turning it around to where I genuinely think the Patriots could finish second in that AFC East there. I think that it'll be a little bit of a dogfight between the Jets and them, and the Miami Dolphins, who we talked about a little bit earlier, is probably going to take a step back. So they weren't even close to the conversation of being second place in that division last year. And I think for them to have a roster in which you can have that kind of faith with the additions that they made on the defensive side of the ball with, Milton Williams coming on the team and Harold Landry and Robert Spillane and Carlton Davis. And then, the safety room's already kind of deep. You just got to figure that out. And then bringing in Morgan Moses, bringing in Will Campbell, bringing in Garrett Bradbury, getting Travion Henderson and Kyle Williams in the loop now, as well as their day 3 picks to help out the depth of that roster and build them out sort of in Mike Vrabel's image now as that as the head coach and the orchestrator of that offense that roster, I should say. I just love everything that the Patriots did. It's not often that teams can sign a new head coach and get that sort of roster turnaround and that sort of turnaround for their outlook, but that's exactly what the New England Patriots did.
No, I think the first thing you look at, and we can kind of go in almost in order of the offseason here, I think this defense might be really, really good when you look at the names now that they have at all 3 levels. And a big one for me also is Christian Barmore getting back fully healthy. If he can be what he was supposed to be when they drafted him and what he was before some of the health issues last year, this defense could be a nasty unit. Christian Gonzalez, Carlton Davis, and obviously better coached under Mike Vrabel, Robert Spillane at linebacker. I think you got the makings of a defense that's going to keep this team in the game every week. And then I look at just what they added, first of all, on the offensive line. Will Campbell at left tackle. Cole Strange only played a couple of games last year. He was hurt too and didn't play until the very end of the season. You get your starting left guard back in there, whether it's then you get center, whether it's Bradbury or Wilson, Morgan Moses, and then you added speed. I really like the element of speed that they added in the draft with Travion Henderson, with Kyle Williams. That's what was missing. This offense was way too plodding last year, way too slow. Now you've got some speed elements that can win vertically, and obviously Stephon Diggs can still win underneath. So I think there's a lot of reasons to feel good about New England, and another team that surrounded a young quarterback in Drake May with all of the right pieces. There's still 1 or 2 more from obviously being championship contenders, and they need May to develop, but it's hard to find a spot here in New England where they did anything wrong this offseason.
I agree. New Orleans Saints, this is my lowest grade here. I didn't quite give them an F, but I gave them a D-. It's close. I don't know how you look at the Saints, and outside of believing in Kellen Moore, who you've now hired as head coach, and maybe you just love where he's going to have this team going moving forward. Brandon Staley obviously has had his struggles in the NFL as a coordinator and also as a head coach. You bring him in as the defensive coordinator there, so there's just a little bit of an unknown. It's not like, ooh, Brandon Staley, that's a recognizable name. That's an automatic win for them. I think that you have to think what version of Brandon Staley or what success level of Brandon Staley are you going to get here? So there's an unknown there. Even independent of the Derek Carr thing, I don't think this roster really got better, and they finished 5-12 last year. So that in and of itself is tough for me. They didn't truly bite the bullet and get in a full rebuild like we've been asking this team to do over the last couple of off seasons. And then Derek Carr just retired. So you're going to start one of Spencer Rattler, Jake Haener, Tyler Shuck. You finished 5-12 last year. I don't know, man. I just look at the Saints, and unless you just really love the head coach signing with Kellen Moore now in the building, it is hard to look at the Saints offseason as anything less than a major step back as a D or an F.
Yeah, no, I think you look at, if we assume Aaron Rodgers is going to sign in Pittsburgh, this is probably the worst quarterback room in the league right now. I think Tyler Shuck's going to start. They didn't draft him 40th overall to not start. If he doesn't start week 1, we're just going to be doing this again next year with them picking in the top 5 and taking either a Manning or a Nussmeier or somebody like that. The offensive line, I love that they drafted Kelvin Banks. I think that was the right move, but that's going to take some time for a team that was last in the league in pass blocking grade. And then this defense is not significantly better. I mean, Justin Reed's the one significant addition at safety, but they were already pretty good at safety with Tyrann Mathieu and Jordan Howden. So I think at corner, on the defensive line, on the interior especially, I have a lot of concerns with their run defense. I'm with you. They won 5 games last year, and it's extremely hard. Unless Tyler Shuck is out of this world as a rookie, the low percentage chance that is the case behind this offensive line especially, I think it's going to be tough to see this Saints team winning more than the 5 games they did last year.
I would agree. And then, there's a quarterback that could be in next year's draft, has a very familiar last name to one that played for the Saints franchise. many years ago.
But there's also the other one whose dad is the offensive coordinator for the team right now. So we're going to get into all sorts.
You got the chance to pick Arch Manning or Garrett Nussmeier. No, I think I know who you're going to pick.
The issue is if Manning, everybody's been saying, he's not coming out in 26. Right. Now, if he's going to be the number one overall pick, especially to New Orleans, to the hometown, that might change the equation a little bit. But we got a whole year to speculate on all of that.
Might change things a little bit. New York Giants. I gave the Giants a C+ here. And I've said this before. I feel for the Giants because they tried, right? They've tried. They made calls for Matthew Stafford. They had a contract offer to Matthew Stafford. They made calls for Geno Smith. So they tried to get better significantly at the quarterback position. Heck, there were rumors that they even made calls to the Tennessee Titans to get up to number 1 overall to see if there was any way that they could get up there to trade for Cam Ward. So, and ultimately, they're not able to do that. They get aggressive. They still get a quarterback. They go get Jackson Dart at the back end of the first round. They didn't pay a ton to be able to have to do that. So I think that's a little bit of a win there for them. Holland and Adebo, I think, really good adds to a secondary that really struggled. I thought the draft was good, pending on what you think of Jackson Dart. I think the rest of the draft was pretty good there. A little worried that they didn't do more on the offensive line, but I think that they have some chips on the table there, and they tried to make some upgrades on the offensive line. It was Greg Van Roten wasn't their first plan, and I think the reason why I ended up just giving the Giants a C+ is not because they didn't try to make these moves, they didn't get them done. Right, I was told that all right, bringing back Greg Van Roten, who's in his mid-30s now, that wasn't plan A, that wasn't plan B, that was kind of what they had to do. It's all right, well, what's the reason for that? Why are you not getting these deals done? These players probably don't want to come and play in New York right now with all the uncertainty that's there. And then with the quarterbacks, you're trying to make swings, and I give you, I give you your props for trying to do that, but ultimately, you didn't get a deal done for Geno. You did not get a deal done for Matthew Stafford. And obviously, you weren't going to be able to get up to number 1 overall with how the Titans think of Ward. So I didn't want to be overly harsh on the Giants, but for as much as I want to give them credit for hey, I think you probably had the right original plans, they didn't really manifest. A lot of their plans to get significantly better this year outside of the draft, which they did, and then I want to praise the secondary too. So maybe B- given expectations of what was going to be for this team. I ended up going with a C+, but that's sort of the range of what I thought for the Giants, who I don't have a lot more faith in for them in 2025, and I think we could be talking about a new regime for them going into 2026.
Yeah, see, that's the tough part, right? Is this entire offseason was kind of executed in the scope of Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll being A, desperate to win, and B, desperate to find an answer at quarterback, right? Now, I do think when you look at the players they got, you could make this a little higher, right? Because what Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston even is way better than the quarterback room they had last year. So then you add Jackson Dart into that. If he's their guy, then cool. Then this could work long term. But I think you look at some of the other guys. You mentioned Paulson Adebo and Javon Holland, and let's not forget the third overall pick, Abdul Carter, going into a defensive line now, and Darius Alexander later in the draft. This could be a nasty defensive line with Carter added into it, with Brian Burns, with Dexter Lawrence. I think you're talking about a defense that got a whole lot better this offseason. But those are the two big questions. When you have quarterback questions and offensive line questions, that can kill your whole team. Absolutely. We've seen that time and time again. So it is kind of an in-between thing. I think the grade gets raised if you're a big fan of Jackson Dart. Neither of us, we both kind of have our questions about Dart and his translatability to the NFL, but that's what it's going to come down to. And the survival of this regime is going to be based on what they can do with Jackson Dart and if they can turn him into a franchise quarterback. Otherwise, you're right. It's actually a pretty talented roster that could be looking at a new staff next year.
Yeah, so maybe I'll elevate in this into the B range, but that's sort of the conversation of where we're at with the Giants. I agree. A lot of it hangs on the Jackson Dart draft and sort of what you thought of him, at least if you're judging it right now, if you're giving it a grade right now. New York Jets, I gave them a B-, whole new coaching staff there. When you look at the Jets, they brought in Aaron Glenn to be their head coach, Tanner Engstrand to be their offensive coordinator, and Steve Wilkes to be their defensive coordinator. So I like the fact that they brought in Aaron Glenn. I think that was the right decision for them. Mucci as well as their new general manager. So they're just making wholesale changes throughout the front office and the coaching staff. And I do like those moves. I really do. So I like that from what the Jets were able to do. I think the roster moves and the draft strategy is a little bit TBD depending on the culture. I think Fields is actually a really good fit for this team that very clearly it's just going to run the ball in 2025, right? I mean, that's what they're going to do. They know that they're not going to be a potent passing attack. They don't have the wide receivers or the tight ends to be able to do it. I know they drafted Mason Taylor, and they're hoping that he could butt into, a wide receiver or receiving option 2 behind Garrett Wilson, but with him being a rookie this upcoming season, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for him, and they don't really have much outside of Garrett Wilson that's proven right now. Allen Lazard's still on the team. Malachi Corley's just got to straight up play better, but very clearly they were going to be a running football team in 2025, and I like Justin Fields being the quarterback to orchestrate that and getting him in there on a 1-year deal. You lose Morgan Moses, you lost DJ Reed, but you got Azareye'h Thomas, you got Armand Membu to sort of replace those guys one for one. So ultimately I went with a B- here for the New York Jets. I don't know if I look at this team and say like, hey, yeah, I see them as significantly better than the year before, but I do like some of the offseason moves that they have made, and I did like some of the bets that they made for the draft. So I ended up going with a B- here. What do you think?
Yeah, this entire calendar year coming up here is just going to be about resetting the culture, and I think this maybe goes up to a B or B plus because I think they're trying to negotiate extensions with Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner, which obviously you identify those guys as foundational players. If you can lock them in long term, this grade even gets a little higher, but I think it's very clear they're just trying to build the culture here. We have to remember how this went in Detroit with Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson. Tanner Engstrand was there too. Look, when that staff was hired in 2021, they only won 4 of their first 24 games. Okay, this year is not going to be about wins and losses with the Jets. This is going to be about fixing the culture of this team, which has been broken for at least 10, if not 15 years, right? And then just identifying who the foundational players are. Look, the Justin Fields signing, if he ends up one of them, if he has a turnaround in his career, like Geno Smith, like Sam Darnold, then fantastic. Is it unlikely? Sure, you're just trying to get football players in here that fit Aaron Glenn's vision. That's all this next year is going to be about. I don't expect them to win maybe but more than 5 or 6 games. It could even be less than that, depending on, if you mentioned it, if the run gets stopped, there's not a whole lot of options outside of Garrett Wilson, right? In the passing game, the defense has to get better, especially on the defensive line around Quinnen Williams. But this year is not about wins and losses with the Jets. I think when you look at now, this was really the offseason that they've reset. It's the first real hard reset since 2020, and I think they're really taking a long-term approach to it.
I gave the Philadelphia Eagles a B, and it was just because it was like we kind of knew a lot of these moves were going to happen. They're kind of ready for it, right? Kellen Moore now gone as offensive coordinator. Kevin Patullo is stepping in as their offensive coordinator, but he's been with the organization, much like the Philadelphia Eagles do with their roster. Like, he's been the passing game coordinator for them for many years, and so he has still been there. So it's kind of like that's fine. You're losing one guy, you're elevating one guy. It is what it is. They lost Milton Williams, they lost Jock Sweat, they lost Darius Slay, they lost Isaiah Rodgers, they traded away C.J. Gardner-Johnson, but they've got the roster depth, and they drafted pretty well to be able to mitigate that. And so a lot of change, a lot of subtractions, a lot of additions. They're the Super Bowl champs. I kind of just look at this offseason and say, yeah, it's fine. Like, Philadelphia did what they needed to do. They lost some big time names in the coaching staff and in the front office, but they have talent on the roster of guys that can be able to step in, and then they reloaded the farm system, I think, with a good draft. So B plus if you wanted to. I mean, I just think this was sort of the offseason that we always thought the Philadelphia Eagles were going to have. They mitigated disaster with those potential losses with the additions that they have, but I don't think the additions that they made put them over the top or anything. I mean, I know they're Super Bowl champions, so they can't go any higher, but I just thought it was solid from Philly, given what we figured was going to happen from them as the Super Bowl champs.
No, I really like the term there you used in a farm system, kind of like baseball, because that's what they do. They just have guys behind the scenes that they get ready for a year or two, and then they're ready to roll, right? I think about even on the defensive side, Nolan Smith, Moro Ajomo, Kelly Ringo, Sidney Brown, if it's going to be him, or Andrew Makuba at safety starting back there. I mean, I think they just have so many guys internally that they feel good about that you just trust Howie Roseman, you trust Nick Sirianni in this process. And to me, they had another stellar draft. I mean, the value that they got, Jahad Campbell falling to them at 31, Andrew Makuba, some of the late round talents that they got, especially on the offensive line, I really think they can develop behind the scenes. So the Eagles, look, this is why they're good every year, is because they just continue to recycle talent, and they have premier talent, as we know, at the top of their roster, but it just feels like they're the team with the fewest holes in football right now.
Steelers, I ended up giving a C-. I could change this to a C+ the more I kind of went back and forth about it, but right now they don't have Aaron Rodgers. So it's kind of really difficult for me to judge their entire offseason if the quarterback that they're courting is here or not, but maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh on that. Certainly, if they sign Aaron Rodgers, I think that this looks different. Now, you also have to factor in, okay, the Metcalf trade. You trade a second-round pick for Metcalf. Now you mitigate that back by trading George Pickens for a third, but then you're paying DK Metcalf. And so if you want to say, hey, these are kind of the same players here, we just believe that DK Metcalf is better, you're still now paying him. And so maybe that was the right move anyways, because if you say, hey, we're going to pay George Pickens close to that money anyways, and we just instead now get to pay it for a player that we think is better, you're just paying it a little bit earlier. You're moving a full round up in sort of the value that you traded for him as a second-round pick and got a third-round pick back for Pickens. But it's an interesting bet for them to make. And then when you look at some of the other additions that they made, I think Darius Slay was a good pickup for them. I think Derek Harmon is a good draft for them in the first round to give them that long-term look on the defensive line. And then I do think that Caleb Johnson is sort of perfect for that Arthur Smith system. So it really comes down to, can the offensive line continue to take that step forward and play really well this upcoming year? Because if they do, man, I think that Caleb Johnson can be a future 1,000-yard back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So this one's a C-, and it's really just a C- because I'm sitting here like, how do you still have quarterback not finalized at this point? And how is Aaron Rodgers still sort of dangling the carrot? Because now, if Aaron Rodgers were to just, let's say he looks at Pittsburgh's situation, knows how desperate they are, and he says, all right, well, now my contract's double the money. I don't care. I'll retire. I don't have to keep playing this game. What does Pittsburgh do if Aaron Rodgers doesn't sign with them? So I think that this was a C- for me initially. I kind of went back and forth again, C-, C+, C+, because I didn't want to be overly harsh on it, but you've given all the power now to Aaron Rodgers, and if he leaves you at the altar, what are the Steelers going to do? Start Will Howard? I think that all of a sudden this season, a lot of the bets that they make look tough if they aren't able to bring in Aaron Rodgers, and even if they do, what version of Aaron Rodgers do they get here? And so a lot of eggs in this basket that are kind of an explosive basket. There's eggs in the basket. There's also dynamite, and I don't really love that here for the Steelers. So I ended up going with a C- here just because of the unknown that we still have with this team.
Honestly, for me, I could argue it even lower. I think Pickens and Metcalf, you basically send out Pickens in a second for Metcalf in a third. You look at the two guys, you look at their numbers from last year, they're just about identical, and Metcalf's a few years older. And then he's in his late 20s. I'm not saying it's a huge deal that Metcalf is 28 years old, but I think, look, I told you at this desk, when the Steelers lost in the playoffs, when the Ravens just absolutely booted them out of the playoffs, they need to have conversations about what they want to be organizationally on offense. I don't think those conversations happen at all. It just feels like the same old approach that we're getting out of the Steelers that we've gotten the last decade, where it's, hey, if we have the best defense in football, we can beat anybody and we can squeak it out in the fourth quarter and win 17-13. Football's not played like that anymore in the NFL. It's just not. It's not played in college. It's not played anywhere like that. Little League maybe, right? But you just don't. You don't win games just on defense every single week. We don't live in that era anymore, and it feels like they really have faith that they can still do that. And now you mentioned it, the way that they've hamstrung themselves with their quarterback situation, a young offensive line with a whole lot of questions, and one proven wide receiver. We're right back where we were last year. It doesn't. I don't think this is the ultimate spinning your wheels type of situation, and the quarterback situation is actually even somehow worse than, because they tried with Justin Fields, and he said, well, no, you benched me. Then they go back to Russell Wilson, and they go, no, you were talking to Justin Fields first. You wanted him back. So you lost both the guys that you had in-house last year, and you bring back Mason Rudolph just because he's familiar, and Aaron Rodgers is basically your last option, and even he's holding out on you. I might go lower than this because I have no idea what the vision, what the philosophy here is offensively. They just cannot try to win games 13-10 every week. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I know you've been a little bit lower on the Steelers, just overall outlook and how they went about this offseason, so it makes sense that you would be on the lower side of things. I figured that was coming. San Francisco 49ers, I gave them a D. I don't really know how you look at what San Francisco did this offseason and feel really great about what they've got moving forward. They lost. Now, okay, they brought in Robert Saleh as their defensive coordinator, which did not play well enough on the defense side of the football last year. Robert Saleh obviously had a lot of success as a defensive coordinator who helped lead them to the Super Bowl, that appearance against the Chiefs. And so with Saleh back on this defense, maybe you feel better about that. So I want to make sure that I give them their credit for getting a seasoned defensive coordinator in a familiar spot with a familiar organization and a familiar coaching staff around them. So I get all that. But no longer have Deebo Samuel, don't have Talanoa Hufanga, don't have Dre Greenlaw, already wasn't playing well enough on the defense side of football, and then you lost those guys as well. Probably felt like they had to go all defense in the draft because they lost those two guys and how bad they were against the run last year. Offensive line lacked any sort of long-term outlook and upgrades. I thought that got ignored during the draft. Secondary got worse. Draft class had a lot of overdrafts, in my opinion. In theory, they will be better against the run, as you can see, like Mykel Williams, Alfred Collins, CJ West, like those guys I think will make this team better against the run. But are the Niners better? Do I feel better about them making the playoffs and making a deep playoff run? No, I don't. I think that this team only got worse this offseason, and it's going to take a very good coaching season from Kyle Shanahan and from Robert Saleh for this team to be in that playoff conversation, in my opinion.
Yeah, they've got a lot of youth on defense, especially, look, and the run defense could be better, but to expect all those guys to play at the level they did in college right away, that's tough. The NFL's a different game. And then I think, to me, there's questions on the offensive line, right? Trent Williams, he's still great, but he's not getting any younger and had some injuries last year. Dominic Puni is great at right guard, but I worry about the other three spots, especially when you're trying to protect a quarterback like Brock Purdy who needs pass protection, right? I mean, every quarterback needs it, but him, especially in the drop back game, it hasn't been great the last couple years in pass protection. Plus, we don't know what the health situation is of Christian McCaffrey either, which could complicate things even further on offense. So it's funny because I think this is a team that could get back to the playoffs if they play their cards right, but it feels like there's some heavy flaws that they have to work through, especially in the trenches.
The Seahawks, I gave them a B for their offseason here. Clint Kubiak, I think, is a good move, bringing him in as offensive coordinator. I'm very excited to see what he is going to do in Seattle. Losing Geno Smith is tough. I'm not going to lie. Like, I give that a negative because I'm a big Geno Smith guy. And for the fact that it got to the point where, new contract or out and you're not comfortable giving him the money and you're comfortable moving on from him, I don't love that. Now, at least you got Sam Darnold to mitigate it, but I think Sam Darnold is a step back, a clear step back from Geno Smith. So I view that as a net negative. I don't see that as a one in, one out. I don't. Now, you traded Metcalf. You moved on from Lockett. You got in Cooper Kupp. You got in Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who played well with Kubiak last year. So, again, I don't know if I see that as a one in, one out, but at least you mitigated it a little bit. Interior offensive line was a major point of weakness for them last year. They get Grace Abel, which I love, but still, you're kind of taking a chance along the offensive line with Olu Oluwatimi at center, and Christian Haynes really has to step up at one of those other guard spots. That's what you're hoping for. Defense, I think, was good last year. I think they will get even better with Nikki Manwari there in that defense, and with DeMarcus Lawrence as their add in free agency. So I think the defense only gets better and more stout with what they were able to do in the draft. But ultimately, with some additions, some subtractions, some net roster negatives, and some positive things that I think they did in the draft and the coaching staff, I ultimately gave the Seahawks a B here this offseason.
Yeah, I actually think that's about right. I think there are some moves where you look at the fit with Clint Kubiak, including Sam Darnold himself, who's familiar from their days together in San Francisco. I think you could certainly have done a lot worse and replacing Geno Smith than Sam Darnold. You could have done what the Steelers did, which is basically nothing to replace their quarterback situation. So I don't hate that as much. I think there's more positivity than people think around the Seattle organization. It's kind of a mini reset considering the names that left the building, but you're right, this defense is going to be good. And even beyond Darnold, you look at this whole quarterback room, Sam Darnold, Drew Lock, and Jalen Milroe. I think drafting Milroe in the third round, late in the third round, is kind of crafty for a team that knows they can sit him behind Darnold for a couple years and at least see what they have. They got Elijah Arroyo at tight end as well. I think that's going to be a move that pays off for him in the passing game. So I think there is more positivity than there was when they traded Geno Smith and DK Metcalf. I think there's something to work with here, and I think it's especially because Clint Kubiak's really going to build this offense in his vision. It might take some time for everything to gel together, but I think this could still be a decent football team this year and beyond if they keep building it right.
Oh, absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. Could have gone, BB plus, something like that. I think I liked more of what they did than they didn't, but again, just losing Geno Smith, and I'm one of those guys. You said it earlier on the show. Like, Geno Smith has been a top 10 quarterback for a good amount of the last 3 years that he has been there. And anytime you're replacing that guy, we're trading that guy away willingly. I get a little bit nervous, especially what Sam Darnold's going to be like behind that interior offensive line, knowing how much Geno Smith mitigated that with the way that he was able to play. So I do still really like what they did. I think the offensive additions in the draft I think are good call-outs by you. So I think it was solid for them. I absolutely think that they're still going to be a force to be reckoned with this season. I gave the Buccaneers an A- here. Now you're losing Liam Cohen as your offensive coordinator, so that's the 90th year in a row that it feels like the Buccaneers are replacing their offensive coordinator and their play caller, but it just sort of is what it is. Josh Gizzard is now in as their offensive coordinator and their play caller, but he was already in the building from last year. So a little bit of a guy who was in this farm system that you probably feel good about there with him as the play caller, getting some chemistry that he already had with Baker Mayfield, now just getting to be the one who calls plays. Now I think they had a good offseason because they bring back Levante David. They kind of get him to feel good about coming back for another year. They bring back Chris Godwin, which I think were their major moves to make. And then they still go out and they got Hassan Reddick, which I think was huge. Now, linebacker went unaddressed outside of them bringing back Levante David when it came to the draft as well. And so you're really putting a lot of eggs in the Savassier Dennis basket with him coming back from injury last year, missed most of last season. You're hoping that he could be the guy that he needs to be at that linebacker spot for them. But they bring in David Walker, they bring in Elijah Roberts along that defensive line to help, and Emeka Egbuka really helps out both the short and long-term outlook of this receiving game to make sure the offense is still potent the way that it needs to be. You bring in two corners that you feel great about in Benjamin Morrison and Jacob Parrish with guys that can play inside and out. And so I think the Buccaneers did a great job. I think losing Liam Cohen hurts, and I think just not getting new linebacker talent I think could be a potential issue, although they brought in Anthony Walker as a little one in, one out from KJ Britt no longer being on the team. So I think that I gave it an A- here because I like a lot of what they did, but you're still dealing with losing your offensive coordinator again here on this team.
It's like we talked about at the top of the show, Trev. You need to get an OC down there in Tampa that does the bare minimum. Just enough to have a good offense, but not quite enough to go and get stolen as a head coach. You need somebody, maybe somebody more that has my mentality. Just get the bare minimum done. We score 28 points. We win enough ball games. We win the division for the millionth year in a row. You need somebody to scale it back just a little bit, just so they don't. You can't just have them all getting poached for head coaching jobs every year. Eventually, one of them might not work. You got to calm down a little at OC. You can't have such great OCs every single year like you've been having.
It's like what you said, at the top of the show. We got to do the bare minimum out here, so I don't have to do all this work, and you're just the one reacting to it. That's
exactly. That's exactly what it is. If you just need to tell some of your people down in Tampa. Just listen. Here's how Dalton does it. This is how you can keep your offensive coordinators. This is the expectations you have to have around here.
I'll let him know. I'll be sure to let him know. I gave the Tennessee Titans a C+ here. Big bets overpays, in my opinion, in free agency with Dan Moore Jr. and Cody Barton. We talked about in the team needs episode. The 5 linebackers on their team that played the most snaps last season are no longer on the roster, and you're really hoping that Cody Barton can come in from Denver and solidify that. Ward really has to pan out for them, right? But that's, I think, typical of that number 1 overall pick bet. It just doesn't feel like this team is that much better. Now, I think that it was always going to be a multi-year rebuild thing for them, and especially with getting Cam Ward, now the clock really starts of let's figure out how we need to build this team around Cam Ward. But when I look at the Titans, I just don't think that they got a lot better as a team outside of the Ward pick. But it's like, okay, you were bad enough to pick number 1 overall last year. You got Ward. I don't know how much credit I could give you for drafting the guy that you were obviously going to draft at number 1 overall. So obviously, I think that they have a better outlook because they have Cam Ward, but in terms of like the offseason and the other things that they could have done, again, I think the Dan Moore Jr. pay and the Cody Barton pay were over the value of what those guys are going to bring. It probably felt like they had to do it, but it doesn't make me feel any better about just looking at how they went about this offseason. So I went with C+ for the Titans here.
Yeah, I don't think there was a ton of free agency moves that you love, but this is now the Cam Ward show, and that's what it's going to be about: is finding weapons, finding the right offensive lineman to block for him, keep improving, especially the back 7 of this defense. I like the interior, I like the defensive line, but pass defense has to get better. But this is going to be about getting Cam Ward through his first 17 games, getting him game reps, and just getting him to learn what it's like to be on an NFL field, right? So it's not most likely, I should say, unless he goes on a Jaden Daniels type run here and gets crazy on the field. But I think this is going to be more in the normal development curve for a quarterback, where it's okay. It's a tough situation. Number 1 overall pick. Trevor Lawrence went through it. Bryce Young went through it. Joe Burrow went through it, right? As guys who were number 1 overall picks going to the worst team in the league. I think for Cam Ward, it's just about seeing by the end of the season that he's better than he was at the beginning of it. That's what it's about, much more than wins and losses in Tennessee this year.
The Washington Commanders, final team here, I gave them an A-. No changes to their coaching staff after a phenomenal year last year. I think was huge for them in the same way that we talked about it for the Minnesota Vikings. So I think that is an excellent win for them there in the offseason to start off with that. Splash trades, getting Laramie Tunsil and Deebo Samuel. I like the aggressiveness there with them fully in on the winning window. Dietrich Wise, Jonathan Jones, some other good depth players that they were able to add in free agency. They bring back Bobby Wagner. They bring back Zach Ertz, these veterans that I think could be really solid for them. Again, Kinlaw, kind of a strange big overpay for them. And outside of that, really didn't address the defensive line, especially the edge rush group, the way that you probably wanted them to for the upgrades. Smaller draft class, but I do think that it was a good draft class. So even with some losing John Allen and sort of replacing him with a big payday for Javon Kinlaw and then not addressing edge rushing upgrades the way that they could have, I still give this an A- of an offseason here for Washington.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a place where you look at them still lagging behind Philadelphia, it's defensively. I'm still worried about this defensive line, and unless we get a breakout from somebody, a young guy like, say, a Johnny Newton or somebody like that, I still worry about this defensive line, especially. I think they're going to be better at corner with Amos in there with a full season of Marshawn Lattimore, Mike Sainristil maybe moving back into the inside. They're really good at linebacker, but that D-line is, I think, what I worry about the most. I love the moves that they've made, around Jaden Daniels, obviously. Deebo Samuel, I like even their mid-round pick, I think fourth-rounder Jalen Lane from Virginia Tech. I like him as kind of a speedy gadget weapon. And then the offensive line, getting Tunsil in there, again, not just getting a guy of that caliber, but I talk about this all the time, what he does to make the entire unit better in pass protection. I mean, imagine that. The Commanders were a bottom 10 to 12 team in pass blocking grade last year, and Jaden Daniels had the year he had. Imagine now that he's protected by guys like Laramie Tunsil and Josh Connerly, and then Sam Cosmi will get healthy, and now you've really got a plethora of guys on this offensive line who can play. This Washington offense looks like it's going to be as dangerous as ever. And I mean, you center it, again, a lot of these teams that drafted, almost every team that drafted a quarterback last year in 2024, they've all done the right things to surround that guy, and that includes Washington here with Jaden Daniels. I think this offense is going to be dangerous. It should be an elite offense as long as Daniels is protected like we think he's going to be. It's going to be fun to watch. The big question is how their defense matches up with the better teams on the schedule, especially Philadelphia.
I think that Washington's been headed in the right direction in a lot of moves since last offseason, and this was another great offseason for them. Appreciate everybody watching the show live, getting in on the chat, getting your thoughts here on the offseason grades. Even if we didn't like your team and you were yelling at us, we do appreciate you hanging out. That's beauty sports, right? The differing opinions. And hey, well, as many of you said in the chat, we will see how it plays out, who ends up being right and wrong. Offseason schedule. So we're moving down to one episode that we have here that we're doing live per week. So we're just doing the Monday shows here for you moving forward, just like this one, 10 a.m., still staying at the same time. But we will continue to have off-season content for you throughout the week. Dalton will continue to do those film breakdowns. And then, of course, you can see the fantasy pods, NFL SE, the college football episodes as well on their respective YouTube channels. So make sure you're subscribed to all of those things. Again, we'll have the one live pod on Mondays at 10 a.m. Eastern moving forward. But then throughout the week, it's going to be a lot of those specific one-off videos. We're doing more detailed breakdowns of a certain player and a certain scheme, a certain coach going to a certain spot, and doing more things to give you an outlook of what we believe is going to happen in the 2025 NFL season. For Dalton Wasserman, I'm Trevor Sikkema saying thank you guys so much for watching the PFF NFL show. See you guys next time.